The macabre story of Judges 19, you won't believe what you will see. There is a story in the Old Testament that I find to be the most unsettling in the entire Bible. It could even be considered inappropriate for some audiences. Before you watch this video, be aware that its content may not be suitable for all ages and might trigger past traumas. The story I am referring to is found in Judges chapters 19-21. Many people are familiar with Judges chapter 19 but do not read the rest of the story. I believe there are several important lessons to be learned from this disturbing tale. First, I will recount the story as vividly as possible, and then I will delve into the lessons we can learn from it. Join me in Judges chapter 19 verse 1. In those days, Israel had no king. A Levite living in a remote part of the hill country of Ephraim took a concubine from Bethlehem in Judah. Picture this: a Levite man in northern Israel acquires a concubine from the south in Bethlehem. However, she was unfaithful to him and returned to her father's house in Bethlehem, where she stayed for 4 months. Essentially, the Levite wanted to get her back, so he traveled from the hill country of Ephraim down to Bethlehem to retrieve her. Upon arriving, the woman's father was very hospitable. Several times the Levite said he needed to leave, but the father insisted he stay another night. This happened repeatedly until the Levite finally insisted he had to leave. Despite the father's hospitality, the Levite explained he needed to return home. He and his concubine then began their journey back to Ephraim. The tragedy unfolds as they travel north. Verse 11 describes how, near the end of the day, the servant suggested they stop in a Jebusite city for the night. However, the Levite preferred to avoid the city since it was not inhabited by Israelites, fearing for their safety. Instead, he decided they should push on to Gibeah. The servant's concern was valid, as it was getting late, but the Levite insisted on traveling further to find a safer place to stay. Let's keep going so we can get to Gibeah, because at least there I know we'll be taken care of. It's a city of the tribe of Benjamin, and our people are there, so they'll ensure nothing bad happens to us. Verse 13 says, "Come on," he said. "Let's try to reach one of those places and spend the night in Gibeah or Ramah." So they continued on their journey, and the sun set as they neared Gibeah in Benjamin. To their surprise, nobody was willing to take them into their home. Hospitality was a significant part of Israelite culture. Then, at the end of the night, an old man came out to the square and said, "Why are you still here? Has anyone taken you into their home?" They replied, "No, nobody has taken us in." The old man then offered, "You can stay with me for the night." The Levite responded, "That's great, and just so you know, we don't need anything from you. We have all our supplies, enough food for our donkeys for me and my concubine. We just need a place to sleep. Even a pillow would be enough." The old man assured them, "No big deal, you can stay with me." So the Levite, his servant, and his concubine stayed at the old man's home in Gibeah. Then this happened. Verse 22 says, "While they were enjoying themselves, wicked men of the city surrounded the house and beat on the door. They said to the old man who owned the house, 'Bring out the man who came to your house so we can have sex with him.'" This is where the story takes a dark turn. The men of Gibeah, some Benjaminites, demanded to have sex with the Levite guest. The owner of the house went out and pleaded with them, "Please don't do this evil, my brothers. This man has come into my house. Don't commit this horrible outrage. Here, let me bring out my virgin daughter and the man's concubine. Abuse them and do whatever you want to them, but don't commit this outrageous act against this man." We'll discuss this later in the video, but what happens next is unimaginable. Verse 25 says, "But the men would not listen to him. So the owner seized his concubine and took her outside to them. They raped and abused her all night until morning. At daybreak, they let her go." This is why I warned that this video could be considered X-rated and might trigger past traumas. Imagine a group of men taking turns raping this woman all night long until morning. Finally, they let her go. Early that morning, the woman made her way back and, as it was getting light, collapsed at the doorway of the house where her master was staying. She was so worn down, beaten and abused, that she barely had the strength to crawl back to the house. She collapsed on the porch and lay there. When her master got up in the morning and opened the doors of the house, the Levite got up in the morning, opened the doors of the house, and went out to leave on his journey. There was the woman, his concubine, collapsed near the doorway of the house with her hands on the threshold. "Get up," he told her. "Let's go." But there was no response. The woman had been abused so severely that she had died. The man put her on his donkey and set out for home. What happens next is both gruesome and sad. When he got home, he picked up a knife, took hold of his concubine, and cut her into 12 pieces, limb by limb. He then sent her remains throughout the territory of Israel. Everyone who saw it said, "Nothing like this has ever happened or been seen since the day the Israelites came out of the land of Egypt until now. Think it over, discuss it, and speak up." The man took his concubine home, dismembered her, and sent each piece to one of the 12 tribes of Israel, likely with a letter explaining what had been done by their own brothers, the tribe of Benjamin. When the other tribes saw and read about what happened, they were shocked, saying nothing like this had ever occurred in their history. There's more to the story in chapters 20 and 21, but I want to pause here to discuss some lessons we can learn from this. The first lesson is that when there is no accountability in our lives, we have a strong tendency to drift. Notice Judges 19:1, which says, "In those days when there was no king in Israel," without anyone to answer to, without any fear of having to explain ourselves or be accountable for our decisions and actions, we are more prone to make poor decisions. This is exactly what was happening in Israel. There was no king, no law enforcement, and people did whatever they wanted without considering the consequences. The second lesson is to ensure that we treat every single human being as an image bearer of God. In the story, the old man said it would be wrong for the men to do what they wanted to the Levite, but they could do whatever they wanted to his daughter and the concubine. His mentality was that the man's life and virtue were worth more than his own daughter and the concubine. We need to ensure we see every person as bearing the image of God. This perspective is crucial, especially when considering the harmful effects of consuming inappropriate material online. If you struggle with watching things you shouldn't, try to see every person as an image bearer of God, as someone's daughter. Would you want someone looking at your daughter in the same way you look at people on those inappropriate websites? Here's the third point I want to highlight in this video. The further you and I drift away from God, the more vulnerable we are to doing things we never imagined we would do. When you examine the book of Judges as a whole, you see a nation of people gradually drifting away from God, slowly backsliding. Judges, chapters 19 to 21, illustrate the culmination of this drift, showing just how far the nation had fallen from God. My friend, you and I are no different. If we don't maintain a close connection with God, if we drift away and backslide, we are just as likely to find ourselves doing things we never thought possible. You might think, there's no way I would get divorced. There's no way I would have an affair. There's no way I'd lose my job for watching something inappropriate online. There's no way I'd start using drugs. But the further you drift from God, the more prone and vulnerable you become to committing those very sins. The story doesn't end in chapter 19, it actually gets worse in chapter 20. A civil war erupts between the 11 tribes of Israel and the tribe of Benjamin, because it was the Benjaminites who committed this heinous act against their fellow Israelites. I encourage you to read Judges chapters 20 and 21 in detail. To summarize, there was a massive battle with thousands of lives lost on both sides. In the end, only 600 Benjamite men were left alive. In chapter 21, the other 11 tribes began to feel pity for the tribe of Benjamin, fearing that they might become extinct. There were 600 surviving men, but no women from Benjamin for them to marry and procreate with. This situation highlights my fourth lesson. Every poor decision we make has consequences that we cannot choose. Although what the Benjamites did was wrong, the decision of the other tribes to fight and kill many of them also had severe repercussions. Both sides had to deal with the fallout of their actions. Remember, you can choose your sin, but you cannot choose your consequences. Every decision you make has consequences, and we don't get to choose those. So what happens next is that the Israelites go and slaughter the men from the clan called Jabesh Gilead. They take 400 women who had never been with a man and give them to 400 of the 600 Benjamite men so they can have wives and procreate. However, this leaves 200 Benjamite men still without wives. This situation highlights how one poor decision can lead to another. The Israelites had taken an oath not to give their daughters to the Benjamites, but they found a loophole. They told the Benjamites about an upcoming festival where their daughters would be dancing. They couldn't give their daughters due to the oath, but if the Benjamites kidnapped the women, it wouldn't technically break the vow. So during the festival, the 200 Benjamite men kidnapped the women and took them as their wives. This story shows how one poor decision can lead to a chain of bad decisions, negatively affecting many people. Many Benjamites died in battle, the people of Jabesh Gilead were killed, their women were taken away, and more women were kidnapped by the Benjamites, causing further suffering and displacement. The final lesson from this story is about God's grace. Despite the destructive decisions made by the Israelites and Benjamites, God allowed the tribe of Benjamin to rebuild and repopulate, preventing their extinction. The book of Judges ends with a powerful verse. In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did whatever seemed right to him. This underscores the chaos and moral decline when there is no accountability. Even in our most destructive decisions, God's grace is present. But we must remember that every decision we make has consequences, often far-reaching and beyond our control. Here are the key lessons from this story. 1. Accountability. Without accountability, we are prone to making poor decisions. Judges 19:1 states, "In those days, when there was no king in Israel," emphasizing the lack of leadership and accountability. 2. Human dignity. We must treat every person as an image bearer of God. The old man's willingness to sacrifice his daughter and the Levite's concubine reflects a disturbing disregard for their dignity and worth. 3. Spiritual drift. The further we drift from God, the more vulnerable we are to sin. The book of Judges shows a nation slowly backsliding, culminating in the horrific events of chapters 19 to 21. 4. Consequences of decisions. Every poor decision has consequences that we cannot choose. The civil war and the subsequent actions taken by the Israelites and Benjamites illustrate the cascading effects of poor decisions. 5. God's grace. Despite our poor decisions, God's grace is still present. The tribe of Benjamin was allowed to rebuild and avoid extinction, showing that even in the midst of chaos, God's grace can be found. The story in Judges 19 to 21 is a powerful reminder of the importance of accountability, the inherent dignity of every human being, the dangers of drifting away from God, the far-reaching consequences of our decisions, and the enduring presence of God's grace. Thank you for watching, and I hope this story encourages you to reflect on these lessons in your own life. See you in the next video. Bye for now.